Okay, so welcome back everybody from the lunch break. I hope you had a good lunch and interesting conversations. For those of you who are here with us in Stockholm, welcome back everybody online. Thanks for joining us again. So we are going straight into session 3, the political visions for a transformative future. So what we want to do in this session is we're looking ahead at the elections to the European Parliament, which are coming up in 1 year from now, in spring 2024. And the parties have, of course, already started to develop their election manifestos. Some of them actively engaging with civil society organizations already. So these election manifestos will, of course, define in how far the European parties are committing to better, stronger European environmental and climate policies in the coming years. Depending on which parties will dominate the next European Commission, the question is, will they present another strong and ambitious package of legislation, of reviews of strategies, of financial instruments to accelerate the transition? Will they present a European Green Deal too? Will the parties in the European Parliament strengthen legislation, close the gaps, set more ambitious targets, and support measures to speed up implementation across member states? So the science is clear that the measures that we've taken so far are not sufficient to tackle the triple planetary crisis and to ensure just transition for everyone here in Europe and globally. However, what we've seen as environmentalists in the last months in particular is growing resistance amongst some political groups to better environmental protections. And we see a return to the old story, the story that short-term economic interest is seemingly more important than focusing on long-term sustainability, resilience, security, and equity for our societies in the long run. So we've talked about nature protection, nature restoration, biodiversity this morning, and just some days ago, we have seen that the European People's Party announced that they are now resisting or opposing the nature restoration law which has been proposed. And they have made this announcement after quite some months of sharing, presenting misleading information about nature restoration, going as far as claiming that villages would be destroyed for peatland rewetting, for instance, even though there's no evidence for that. So it's with a disappointment that the EPP is the only party, the only pro-European, larger European party which is not here to discuss with us today. But we hope that we can maintain a constructive dialogue also with them, based on science and based on the objectives that they have also committed to in the European Green Deal. So this session is now going to bring together 4 representatives from 4 different European political parties to talk about their visions for the future. And we're asking them how they want to address the challenges we face and contribute to a sustainable future. Are they going to show leadership for a European Green Deal 2, a new package of ambitious legislation and measures and better implementation of those? So for those of you here in the room and also online, please continue sharing your thoughts with us on Twitter, but also going back to Slido to ask questions. We'll come to questions from you directly in the audience and from Slido towards the end of the session. So before I'll introduce you to our panel, I'll hand over to our Secretary General, Patrick ten Brink. He will present the EEB's vision for a European Green Deal 2, or as we call it, a pact for our common future, a vision that we will continue to develop in the coming months with a broad range of stakeholder groups, and which we're going to advocate with the political parties all the way to the elections and beyond. So Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I mean, Luke this morning, he mentioned that he was finding it rather difficult to deal with all climate issues in 4 minutes. And so I need to prepare basically in 10 minutes a presentation of how we're going to solve everything. So you'll just have to bear with me. I'll be relatively light. But I wanted to start with saying this is our vision of the Green Deal. It's developing. We'll develop it in dialogue throughout the next 12 months. And I wanted to start with our beautiful Earth here, just to underline how fragile it is. I'm not actually advocating for us to go to the moon. That's not the way we fix it. We actually sort it out domestically. When Ursula von der Leyen launched the European Green Deal, she said it would be Europe's man in the moon moment. So that means it's important, it's historic, it gives hope. So the question is, will this Green Deal be a person in the moon moment? So if you allow me a little bit of time to develop the analogy, we need to move from where we are here to the moon in this analogy and have a rocket. And if you think of all the files that we have in the Green Deal so far, the quantity and the quality of the files are basically like the fuel. Then to get out of the orbit, you need to push-pull against gravitational pull. So here, the gravitational pull is a bit like the status quo. So the orbit is, if you get stuck in orbit, it means you haven't gone out of the status quo, and we need to move beyond the status quo. And deregulation pressures, as Patrizia said, is a bit like a fuel leak. So if we think of this, that we're basically in a situation where we have a fuel leak, we've got a lot of files which are much weaker than they should be, some are a bit delayed, and so we basically are very unlikely to be able to get out of the orbit of the moon of the status quo currently. We'll be able to take off, we'll not be able to go far enough. So we'll need a second Green Deal. So in this morning, you heard about the triple crisis, and Michael Ley is very right. It's not just a triple crisis. You've got a social crisis, you've got governance crisis, a political crisis, and there's a number of crises that we need to respond to. But this is in some ways a bit of a negative driver, negative motivator for action. So I want to then say we need, okay, to respond to crisis, but I think we also need to basically look at hope and look at what we want. And that's particularly important in the context of the current, the heading European elections, because these should be an election of hope. So on this issue here, what do we actually want, an agenda of hope? At the core of it, we need a safe operating space. I don't know how many of you immediately spot acronyms here, but the acronym for safe operating space is SOS. And of course, for that, we need healthy soils, we need zero pollution, we need a safe climate, a strong nature. We also need, if we're going to move forward, and if the electorates are going to go with it, the citizens, the consumers go with it, we also need the sustainable choice to become the easy choice. It shouldn't be a pain for everyone. It should be that choice. So here, we need safe, durable, repairable products. We need healthy nutrition. We need trustworthy green claims. We also need justice, environmental justice, climate justice, and social justice. For each of those, we need, for example, equity and equality, no one left behind. Global responsibility, I mean, Europe's not alone, is important. The well-being economy, the polluter pays. And we also need good governance and institutions we trust. And this gets back to the European elections. So here we need to implement our commitments. We need active and participatory democracy. We need science-based policy, et cetera, and most of all, we need youth leadership and to listen to that. So somehow we need to package a response to the various crises with the pull of a vision of hope and package it into a Green Deal too. So this is what we've done. And we've put it into a structure of four, and we'll present this and then have a few examples. But the first thing, we need to sharpen and communicate our vision and principles for our common future. We need to drive transformative system change for this. And this, it's actually pushing for transformative system change. Rights are at the heart of this. So this is individual rights, but it's also indigenous rights, as we heard this morning. They need to be there for us to have a trust and a solid vision of a positive way forward. The second chapter of the whole thing is keeping our promises. We've promised a lot in the Green Deal, we've promised a lot in the acquis communautaire, we've promised a lot internationally. We need to deliver on that. And so the Green Deal too should have a strong thread of implementing measures and enabling measures on this to reach the very laudable targets of zero pollution, zero carbon neutrality, toxic-free environment, etc. A third chapter has to be around promoting a just transition as a new social contract. We need citizens to believe that the governments are actually doing the right thing. So it needs to be a de facto social contract. And here we need to have the social measures, not just add-ons at the end, but fully integrated. And then the fourth, we need to chart a path to 2040 and 2050, and this will inevitably go beyond the Green Deal one. And within this, what we've been trying to do is look in the different thematic areas. What are the gaps? What are the barriers? Where do we need to ramp up ambition? And so here I'll pick up a few of the pieces, and there's too much here to share, of course, but we'll share the slides, but just some elements. And I think the four representatives of the political parties weren't there this morning, so I just want a couple of things back. We need to respond to the crisis. On the climate side, we need to basically have investment certainty for a move to 100% renewables. We need to, of course, the barrier is the fear of the social backlash, and which is going to hold it back. So we need to launch robust social measures, not as add-ons, as I said, but fully thought through and co-created between the social society and then the wider environmental civil society. And there's a whole host of other issues, but that's just to whet your appetite for you to then read the presentation, and the documents will circulate to you. But not all is crisis response. There's also transformative opportunities. So here, it's the circular economy. We know the circular economy will reduce energy use, and it's a lot of potential. But actually, one thing I wanted to talk about is we need more durable, repairable, reusable, and fully recyclable products. We need, as citizens, as we head to the election, we need to trust our governments to be able to offer those. We also need to recognize that in this promised system change from a linear to a circular economy, it's basically a non-balanced playing field. It's too easy just to take, make, and use and dispose. We need to actually find a clever way of making sure that we are actually incentivizing the right choice. And we need to make sustainable products the norm, as mentioned before. Back to the crisis, we talked a lot about protecting and restoring nature, and I think the speakers already said that we need more legislation, we need soil and forest laws, ocean laws, climate adaptation. A barrier is, of course, funding. We need to make it happen, so we need to address that barrier. And the big, big issue is that we just have not had the ambition or the political will to address the common agricultural policy. So this, again, is a massive crisis. But to be positive and look on the opportunity, there is a transformative opportunity around the Sustainable Food Systems Law. We have the possibility to use this and build on the farm to fork strategy to reshape the food environments to make healthy and sustainable choice the easy choice. This has to be the base of it, and that has to be at the core of the next Green Deal. With barriers is, of course, the siloed policy making, agricultural policymakers defending vested interests. We can't keep going. It has to be a whole of government. We need to take decisions which are right for the whole of our society. So we need to set a clear direction of travel for sustainable food system laws to a fair, healthy, and sustainable food system. Now, the third crisis we talked about this morning was, of course, chemicals. And it was amazing to hear all the numbers this morning. But just one thing, here I said no data, no market. Earlier we discussed no data, no problem. But I think that is a problem. So we need to basically push for the no data, no market. If you can't give the information, you shouldn't be able to put your products on the market. We recognize the level of ambition, level of information and transparency is terrible, and we need to address that. And we need to promote innovation that serve people and the planet and not just short-term economic interests. So here, regulation is key, and the REACH revision, which has been delayed and risks being diluted, needs to be done in June, so it has a chance to be done between this Commission and Parliament. There's, of course, pollution is not just chemicals, it's also air. We need to push for a zero pollution Europe by 2035. We need to recognize the fact that over history and even today, there's insufficient consideration of health and environmental protection, priorities and objectives in the various different policies. The long term isn't sufficiently reflected. And so we need to basically, the way forward, we need to adopt policies that reflect science, and the WHO already gives us a guiding light. So then, I've got 2 minutes to save the world. So then there's other issues, and just a couple of issues here. Environmental law and governance. We've seen across Europe and across the world issues of environmental defenders and civil society space. We need to protect the environmental defenders here. In the wider debate in European Union, you have something called better regulation. And here they talk, it makes it sound good. Everyone likes the term better regulation, but they use the word burdens. But actually, if you look closely at the word burdens, it's not really a burden, it's a responsibility. So why are we calling it a burden? So we should look at the framing and look at the bias in the framing and try to move towards responsible regulation rather than something of burdens which actually holds us back, like the gravitational pull, constantly pulling us back to restricted ambition. And we also need governance changes. Every single new commission, we have a chance of changing the architecture. We have EU enlargement coming. We could have new commissioners. So why not focus on what we need and have a commissioner for future generations, for inclusivity, for rights, for indigenous rights, because we need to have our representatives representing what's important to all of us in Europe. And then we can actually believe in the European project and believe in our electors in the parliament, if that's what's there. We've also got water, we've also got economic transition, but there's no way in 15 seconds I can do justice to this report that you'll have seen. Have a look at this, it's really, really good. There's a lot of interesting articles, but in this context, we really need a good part of active democracy and debate, and we need to really think through what is possible with green growth and what is not, and how to couch it in a way where we bring people on board rather than separate people. So these are basically different elements. So now to my last slide, and I've got 11 seconds left. We're approaching now the European elections, and the elections are, of course, about convincing the public that you can offer them a better choice. So these are then points then for the speakers coming up. What is the legacy you wish to leave? Are you committing to closing the gaps the Green Deal is behind? Can we trust you to do that? Can we vote for you? What practical advances will you commit to? And we've seen the extinction about biodiversity. We're living in the 7th extinction age. So did any of you who are now going to speak rebel against the ongoing extinction? And if so, how? And finally, what will your party offer to address the climate and environmental anxiety? We can't have our children suffer from this anxiety. So how can you give us all hope? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing our vision for the EGD2. And if you're following us on Twitter, you can now already see the summary of Patrick's presentation that we have published online this afternoon, if you're curious to read it up again. And then hopefully follow us in the next months while we're developing a more detailed vision of this European Green Deal too. So let us now welcome our guests online. Welcome to the EEB's annual conference. I'm going to introduce the panel to you. So all of our speakers are online, and we're very grateful for having them with us today. So the first one I'm going to introduce is Diederik de Setzen. He's the Deputy Secretary General of ALDE, the European Liberal Party. And he is the campaign director for ALDE's 2024 election campaign, which is why it's great to have him here today with us. And he was already responsible for the election campaign in 2019 with ALDE's Team Europe around Margrethe Vestager and Guy Verhofstadt. So welcome very much, Diederik. Then we have with us Thomas Weiz. He is an Austrian member of the European Parliament, sitting amongst others on the Agriculture Committee. He is a co-chair of the European Green Party together with Melanie Vogel. And he's also an organic farmer in Styria in Austria, and he's known for direct actions, calling out issues ranging from illegal animal transports to stationing of nuclear weapons. So thank you, Thomas, for joining us today. Then we have with us Elli Chrysantakopoulou. She's been advising the Party of European Socialists, PES, for more than 10 years on economic and financial policy, having a background in political economy. And she's currently the PES advisor for the Green Deal, Environment and Climate Change. Welcome, Elli. And then we have, and that's only coincidence, that we have another Austrian politician with us, Walter Bayer. He was elected president of the Party of the European Left last year, and he's been a leading figure in the Austrian Communist Party for decades and was one of the co-founders of the Party of the European Left. He has a PhD in economics and has written quite extensively about the history and politics of his party. So welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us today. So we have a first opening question for all of you, and you will have some minutes to elaborate on those questions. Then we will probably have time for a very quick follow-up question to each of you before we're going to open to the floor for questions from the audience here in the room and on Slido. So let's go into our first round of questions for you. I'm going to start with Elli. So this morning we've heard quite a bit about how, despite all the efforts that have been made with the European Green Deal, we need more ambitious environmental and climate action, while at the same time we need to make sure the European Green Deal laws and policies are fully implemented across the EU. So looking ahead at these elections next year, we would like to hear more about PES vision for a better integration of social justice with environment and climate action. So looking ahead at these elections, what kind of European policies are needed to ensure social justice and equality while accelerating towards our environmental and climate objectives? Ellie.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to taking part to your conference. So for the Party of European Socialists, the green transition which we're undergoing must be a social transition. Otherwise, it will not work. In the effort of becoming climate neutral by 2050, we must leave no one behind. Social, environmental, and economic policy must go together. Much has been achieved so far in implementing the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package, despite a rather difficult legislative mandate, and I refer to the COVID crisis, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, all these events that have changed our lives over the past 4 years. And I think that much of the Green Deal success can be credited to the work done by the Commission Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans, but also, of course, our leaders, our ministers, our commissioners and MEPs. I want to refer just to some recent success because I think they are significant. The PES warmly welcomed the recent agreement on the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the emission trading system. Putting a price on carbon emissions is one thing, but using the revenue to help those most affected by this transition is another. So the Social Climate Fund that is created for those who cannot otherwise afford clean energy, insulation, clean transport, and we are very happy about that. But indeed, more needs to be done. Without any doubt, this transition is a very difficult exercise, but it's also a great opportunity. The European Green Deal sets out an ambitious plan that is essential for our health, our prosperity, our security now and in the future. This is not just about saving our planet. This is mostly about saving jobs, or rather creating new and better ones. It is about saving our economies. It's ultimately about saving our well-being. The climate crisis is an existential crisis. If we don't increase our efforts to master this transition, to reduce emissions, to mitigate the emissions, and to adapt to the already existing climate crisis, if we don't do this with much intensity, we will start waging wars over food and water. So coming back to your question about what are the next steps for the PES, so the PES is committed to reach climate neutrality by 2050. To achieve this, we need to speed up decarbonization efforts. So the PES has been calling to fast-track investments in renewable energy, and we really want to stress this. We need cheap renewable energy to heat our homes, cook our meals, power up our economies, and get to places. All of us have felt the recent rise in energy prices. Unaffordable energy is a very big concern, especially to the vulnerable in societies. Those political forces who oppose the Green Deal try to use the situation to dilute and delay the green transition. But we must remember, it's not an energy crisis we face, it's a fossil fuel crisis. The faster we transition away from expensive and polluting fossil fuels, the faster we can bring down bills for people. We have to invest in green technologies and give Europe the competitive edge it needs to become more resilient and strategically independent. Through Repower EU, put forward by Frans Timmermans, we are doing that, exactly that, cutting our reliance on Russian fossil fuels. But most importantly, we need to convince everyone that this transition is unavoidable, that we are all in this together. Installing heat pumps, solar panels, driving electric is not just for the climate, it's basically for us, our kids, and theirs. I don't want to sound cliche here, but this is very important because there is still a lot of climate skepticism. It was brought up before. Climate denialism is pushed hard by populist and far-right parties, some of which are finding their way into power, and this is very worrying for us. So if done correctly, this transition can help bridge existing inequalities. It can promote both social and territorial cohesion, but this is mainly a political choice. The PES has been calling for the protection of quality social services, to support skills development and trainings, to support SMEs, to actively involve social partners and make the best use of both public and private funding. What the PS calls for is a just transition that leaves none behind. The PS also acknowledges that this transition will not be easy, but the climate and biodiversity crisis and their consequences are clear. For the PS, this transition is about promoting a healthy and sustainable society, economy, and planet. And the PS wants society to be part of it. We want to empower people to make the necessary changes that are needed. And to quote Franz Timmermans here, if people are not part of this, then people will reject this, and then we will all have failed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. So that was a clear message and about the centrality of making people central in the decision making and in the transition. And I'm sure we'll come back to that point. So let's go to Diederik and ALDE. So ALDE has been arguing for a balance between energy production, economic development, and environmental protection. Looking at the status of the planet, but also our societies, we have not yet found that balance that would allow for a healthy economy, equitable societies within ecological limits of the planet. So looking ahead at the elections, what is ALDE's vision of how we can ensure that all can live well within planetary boundaries? And what are the kind of concrete rules and regulations, what kind of new instruments will ALDE push for at a European level to achieve the transition and to leave no one behind?
Thank you very much, Patricia. You mentioned a bit my role in 424 in 19. I also used to live in Stockholm, so I really regret I couldn't be there with you at Kulturhuset. It would have been great. And for a country that likes environment so much, but also Eurovision, I can already say that it's 12 points for EEB today and this Swedish presidency in what you developed for that. Look, I think in a past life, I worked for the renewable energy industry in European affairs. And I think one element that has substantially changed in recent times is this unprovoked, obviously, invasion of Ukraine, which has again put the urgency for energy security and the dependency reduction up front. I think it's our German party leader, Christian Lindner, that said that renewable energy currently is freedom energy. But overall, and I think I will disappoint Patrick ten Brink, what you're going to get here is not a sales line of politicians, but show you a little bit how we are going in the process of a manifesto and our position so far. But it will be validated later on. So we're not fully done with the process, which is good news for actors like EEB, because you can still contribute also to a manifesto. I think as liberals in general, as you know, we try to prioritize progress, innovation, but also creativity for better climate solutions. And I think some of the main points that will come up are threesome. First, there's this element that's always very close to our hearts because we believe it works very efficiently, is public-private partnerships. This is something that we found is a good way to leverage both public but also private resources towards sustainable development. And initiatives such as carbon pricing, they tend to encourage businesses and consumers to reduce their carbon footprint. We also need to invest in education and training. As you know, we need to develop the skill sets necessary to make this transition. And then there needs to also be an element to assist countries, to assist member states that experience economic burden due to energy and material costs. And in short, we need, and we're going to come up with a clear funding path for this transformation. And I think these are the main elements. Maybe one point that is important to say is that we do also need to keep some perspective in this discussion in the way that we are in a way already leading in this transition. And I'm not saying that it's sufficient, but if you look at the net outflows in the US for sustainable elements, that is about 12 billion. I'm looking here, we're at 126. So I think disregarding the numbers, it's important to show that we are already leading in this transition, but we should obviously continue our efforts. And I think these three small points that are our main axis to approach that are parts of the response. Thank you.
Thank you, Diederik, for giving us that overview. So let's go to Thomas from the European Green Party. So as we all know, the European Green Deal has put a very strong focus on decarbonization. We're not there yet, obviously. We now see that nature restoration is, well, under discussion, if not under fire. And we must make progress towards safeguarding nature and biodiversity. We've heard quite a lot this morning about the pushback and the resistance from different sectors for better protection of human and environmental health. We've zoomed into chemicals this morning. So while we're still fighting to get most of this European Green Deal, we would like to hear from you. What vision do you have for the European Green Party? What is it that you're presenting in the run-up to the 2024 European elections? And what are the key solutions that you will push for at European level, looking beyond this year into next year?
First of all, thanks for having me. I'm really sorry that I can't join you in Stockholm. I'm here in Strasbourg. We just started our voting session of this week, and we're trying to push through as many amendments that strengthen the current proposals that come from a Green Deal. So that's why I can't join you in person. And basically, I liked your first intervention very much because it focuses a lot on policies based on science. And this is unfortunately not something that you can take for granted, especially not here in the European Parliament. The first question is, do other political actors really accept scientific findings and scientific knowledge as facts that we need to base our policies on, or are they not doing that? So are they accepting that science clearly tells us if we do not reduce massively climate emissions of all kinds, we're facing an accelerated global warming that will not just endanger our livelihood, our economies, but basically the whole biosphere of the planet. Do they accept that as a basis of policies or not? Do political parties accept that renaturation is there to keep CO2 in the soil? If we talk about rewatering of peatlands and wetlands, that this is an active climate measure and not an attack on agriculture. That biodiversity, that preventing the big mass extinction is a key element for future food production. So, I mean, no nature, no food. Do we really understand that? And do colleagues really share that insight, that scientific insight, that the decline of insects, of birds, and so on is firing massively back also on our production capacities, that we need the water retention of these areas, of also rewilded rivers to prevent floods, but also to keep the water in the ground, to give it time to actually sink into the soil water, to actually have access to drinking water or water, what we need for industrial production, but also for agriculture in some parts of Europe. Or do we accept that we have, I don't know, thousands of premature deaths due to air pollution, but also to groundwater pollution, that we have massive impacts of pesticides on our health. It's not just, I mean, all the citizens that suffer from cancer, but it's also a massive impact on the public budgets that we have. And so the money that we then still need to actually help out society, help all the vulnerable people in society to deal with the crisis that we're currently in. And do we accept that industrial agriculture is basically destroying the soil, so the basic fundament of production that we base our food production on? Are we accepting this scientific reality, or that we need close to nature forestry to have any chance to reach climate neutrality? And unfortunately, this acceptance of scientific realities is not so much common here, not in the European Parliament and also not in the Council. I mean, I don't need to comment on what EPP has been releasing last week. They are obviously in favor of poisoning the landscape and destroying nature, but it's unfortunately also parts of the colleagues that are here today. It's not the whole groups, but you know, if you talk about agriculture with parts of European Socialist Party, it doesn't look that good, unfortunately. And also the liberals are very split. There's parts of the liberals that really go with us with an ambitious climate and nature policy, but there's unfortunately bigger parts, meanwhile, that split the liberals in this regard, and that put actually business interests first, business interest second, business interest third, and then maybe some environment last. So the main question to me is not what politicians actually declare on Sunday speeches or in the panel here, but rather what they actually do. What kind of amendments do they bring up? What are they voting in favor? Are they really walking the talk? And there I have maybe different opinions on being all too shiny and bright on other political parties, but I'm happy about every support and every alliance that we can find, and I'm regularly working. You can basically sign up to the actual complete plan that you have been presenting in the morning when it comes to the next Green Deal. And you also already mentioned some of the biggest loopholes that we're still facing. If we don't get going with agriculture and forestry, which is basically the whole land cover that we're talking about, except some environmentally protected areas, if we're not changing the model of production in agriculture, we have no chance to stop the mass extinction. We have no chance to stop the amounts of emissions. And by the way, agriculture could be and should be part of the solution, because I don't know if anybody has a better idea than using plants and the photosynthesis of plants to recapture the CO2 from the atmosphere and bring it back down into the soil. And the same counts for forestry. Big resistance also from liberal parties, especially in the north, to change the forestry model from a clear-cut extractivistic approach to a close-to-nature model where you can basically have water retention, biodiversity, a good growth of wood, so also potential harvest with global warming adaptation, with the capacity of forests to react to climate changes. And so whether we will get majorities for that, let's see. Our job in the moment is still to bring to reality the existing proposals of the Green Deal. And I must say, respect to the current Commission. The Commission is not compiled of green politicians, not at all, but it's compiled upon politicians that are obviously accepting scientific reality and that have come up with good proposals. They are not going as far as we need to go, but they are going into the right direction and they are ambitious, I must say, and I respect that. The question is, can the commissioners actually really get their own parties on board, or do their own parties actually contradict the process there? So it's about walking the talk. You mentioned earlier that I'm very much out there fighting illegal deforestation, fighting the cutting down of the last primeval forests, animal welfare in transports to go against industrial agriculture. So that's what we're doing with everything that we can. And for the next term, which I will maybe still be an MEP here in the House, major focus on the common agricultural policy and on forestry issues, because if we don't fix that, we will fail.
Thank you, Thomas, for this very passionate appeal for sustainable food systems and agriculture. And I guess for all of us in the environmental movement, the contradictions between the common agricultural policy and the objectives of the European Green Deal is one of, if not the biggest failure of this European Green Deal. So thank you for focusing on this. So let's go to Walter. So I wanted to talk with you a bit more about the economic transition. So we've been talking about this whole morning. We've been talking about this, very broad range of environmental and climate laws that we have seen in the past years and what is still needed. What is also clear that with a European Green Deal 2, we need to move beyond an approach which is still somewhat isolated with environmental regulation here, social regulation there, trying to somewhat patch up the failures of the economic system. And we need to move towards more integrated policies that drive system change. So you're an economist yourself, and I'd like to hear from you what suggestions the European left has for the economic transition that you can highlight for us. What are concrete European policies that we need for a new socio-ecological contract?
Hi, warm salute from Vienna to Stockholm and Strasbourg. Thank you for having me and providing the possibility for this dialogue. I can say that I could fully subscribe to the agenda which was laid out by the General Secretary at the beginning of this session. And actually, the integration of the ecological and the social agenda will be the red-green thread in the electoral manifesto of the European Left Party. First, because it's obvious that any social progress we have achieved in the past and we might achieve in the future would be meaningless unless we are able to rehabilitate the ecological frame of our societies, or to say it in a more philosophical way, the reconciliation of the relation between human society and nature, which has been destroyed in the course of capitalist development. On the other side, the ecological transformation which is necessary, which is the clear evidenced by scientific research. I fully subscribe to those who say our policy must be based on scientific evidences. However, any ecological transformation can not be imposed by an enlightened elite. It will only be effected under the condition that the protagonists of the change will be the people themselves and will be the laboring classes. That's why we support the concept of the just transition, which means connecting the ecological transformation with the protection of the rights of the working classes, which expanding the rights of the working people, with doing away precarization, extending also the participatory possibilities on the level of enterprises. So in any way, there must be an organic link between the ecological and the social dimension of the change we want to see. But let's address the white elephant in the room of this discussion. And the white elephant is the fact that we are talking about power, that we are talking about money, that we are talking about the distribution of resources and life chances, both in the global and in the regional and the national scale. I mean, it's not only about, so to say, having a nice social agenda, it's about achieving economic and social equality. To give you an example, in my home country, Austria, the richest 10% of the society account for a double as much CO2 emissions as the poorest, 4 times as much CO2 emissions as the poorest 10%, and it's double as much as the median of the society. So it is a question of equality. It is a question of resources. The idea of a social and ecological transformation according to our convictions must therefore be buttressed by robust politics. We need an ecological European program of public investments in infrastructure, in healthcare, in affordable housing, in sustainable transport system, in education, in culture, and in renewable energies. Indeed, the Recovery Fund represented a change in European politics. I would not speak, the Germans like to have these big words, man on the moon moment, Hamilton moment. I mean, this is far exaggerated, but it is a different philosophy, and we must avoid that we fall back in the failed patterns of austerity policy, for example, by re-establishing the suspended Pact on Growth and Stability, as it is proposed, if I'm rightly informed, by the Finance Minister in Germany, Mr. Lindner. We think that the Growth and Stability Pact must be replaced by a pact focusing on cohesion, economic convergence, and ecological transformation. Last but one remark. It's obvious that the transformation we want to see will require huge amounts of investment. And it's also true that the European Central Bank can become an instrument of financing transformative projects. But at the same time, we must be aware that there is huge money out there. The biggest oil companies, according to Oxfam, last year have doubled their revenues. The richest people, also in the European Union, managed to avoid serious taxation on their wealth and their incomes. So we need to get hold of these enormous amounts of money. That's why you will find in our electoral manifest one of the most important chapters, tax the rich. Get the money where it is. Follow the money in order to redirect it to the goals and the objectives we set out. And allow me now a final remark, which also somehow addresses a white elephant in the room. All what we are saying about ecological and social transformation is meaningless unless we can have peace in Europe, unless we can return to a policy which allows us to redirect the enormous amounts of money which are going to the armament, to the ecological rehabilitation. 2.4 trillion, as we know from CIPRI, last year were spent for armaments. No question that the war which was started by Russia is an unlawful war. It's a crime against humanity. At the same time, I wish to say that we want to see tripling the efforts and doubling the efforts for a diplomatic solution so that Europe can focus on those issues which are really relevant for the future of our societies, which is social justice, which is equality, which is ecological rehabilitation. And finally, what gives hope? Our party bases its politics on two foods. One foot is in the institutions, one foot is the civil society, are the NGOs and are the movement. And what gives me the most hope is the fact that we see now a young generation pouring out to the streets, demanding a change in politics, a system change, and I believe this is the strongest sign of hope which we have at the moment in Europe. Thank you for your patience and attention.
Thank you, Walter. So I think you listed a lot of potential policies and measures for the economic transition. So I think that will definitely feed into our discussion, and also thanking for reminding everybody what inequality in light of the transition to zero carbon neutrality means, and the figures that you mentioned for Austria are similar for, of course, for the whole of the region. So we have a second round. I have like a very quick follow-up question for each of you, but I'd really like you to give me just like 1 minute, just like one thought, and not to elaborate much more in detail, because I already see that we have a lot of questions from the audience on Slido, and I'm also going to see them in the room. So let's just make sure we have enough time for the audience. So Ellie, I wanted to come back to you, and it ties in nicely with Thomas' appeal for sustainable food systems. So we know that this is one of the big issues that the coming EU leadership will have to realize, even though we are waiting for a legal proposal here. And in the past, there's often been like a contradiction on the one hand between, sustainable food, and on the other hand, the affordability, the accessibility, kind of, the luxury. Is it a luxury to have access to sustainable food? So can you give me one idea of a concrete measure that the PES is suggesting to make sure that healthy and sustainable food becomes the norm and becomes accessible for all?
I think that when we transition towards sustainability, food systems must play a key role. And we must invest in reducing the environmental impact on the food systems. The farm to fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy that were presented in 2020 by Franz Timmermans aim to do that. So I think that we can raise three very important points here. So first, we need to reduce emissions in food production and consumption. We need to halt biodiversity, and we need to reduce food waste. So these are three axes that we need to work at the same time so that we can ensure the food security and food affordability. We need to support farmers and fishers. We need to reward them for making nature a key part of their business models, for not using synthetic fertilizers, for fishing sustainably, for regenerating their soils, because it's very true. We cannot plant trees on dead or infertile soils. We cannot create food from there. We need clean soils to absorb carbon. And we need a strong and efficient common agricultural policy to do so. We need to empower consumers to make informed choices about food as well. We need to be able to give them the opportunity to find healthy and better sourced food at affordable prices. And this is something that has to appear very strongly in our political aims for the next years. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. So it sounds like we can count on you that you will make this one of the priorities in your election manifesto. Let's go to Diederik. So this morning we've been talking a lot about the struggle to end the use of hazardous chemicals, even where they're used in consumer products, and how difficult that fight is. But another major environmental health problem that we haven't been talking about enough this morning is air pollution. It still causes more than 200,000 premature deaths every year in Europe. There are, of course, current ongoing discussions, and ALDE is not necessarily playing the strongest role in those discussions. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you will be promising to your voters in 2024 to protect our health and to ensure the zero pollution future that we all want?
Yes, I'm talking to you from Brussels, where I live with 3 small children, and so indeed, even personally, the element of air pollution is something that is really a concern. The answers are really, again, threefold. A bit like Eli, I mean, there's definitely still promotion of renewable energies is something that there is still so much that can be done, and not only in wind, but or solar energy, but look at the initiative of a number of party leaders, including Prime Minister De Croo, to have the biggest offshore wind farm. I mean, renewable energy is still something that there is a lot of room to improve. Energy efficiency, and there, well, it sounds boring like an acronym, and I know we already have a fair share with GDPR, etc. But if you look at another acronym, EPBD, the Energy Performance in Building Directive, it's a very big legislative package with very high ambitions. And this is part of the response to improve energy efficiency in Europe. And then third, again, as I mentioned before, but there is still room also for research and development, and this is something where we have to continue our efforts. And with this combined 3 main axes, I think is where we will book success. And well, I think that answers your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Diederik, and also for kind of highlighting the link between climate and air pollution, and there's mutual benefits if we align solutions there much better. Thomas, I wanted to come back to you because actually today we're also launching a publication together with a Green European journal, together with Oikos magazine, on imagining a post-growth future, post-growth futures for Europe. And in the green parties across Europe, we generally see a lot of support for this kind of thinking. And it's already 2 years now that the European Environmental Agency has told us that it's very unlikely that we will be able to sufficiently decouple economic growth from the environmental pressures, which is why we need to envisage that post-growth future in Europe. Now, looking ahead again at your election manifesto, at future policies that you will be promoting with the European Green Party, is there an example that you can mention of a policy that will help us to get out of that dependence on infinite economic growth? For instance, in Austria, we've seen the recent example on putting in place targets on material use reduction, similarity to reduction targets for greenhouse gas emissions. Is that something that you would be willing to campaign for on the European level as a priority?
Well, first of all, I would have hoped that colleague Dietrich would say, well, we need an end of the combustion engine to better the air pollution, but unfortunately, maybe he was not able to or allowed to. But this would be one of the main measurements. And then on the growth question, first of all, we have to accept that growth is not telling us anything about the well-being of population, and that only looking at economical growth, environmental costs, long-term costs, impact on our basic components of productivity. If you do not take this into account, it actually doesn't clearly measure not even the economic performance of a country. So we need to overcome that dogma that only economical numbers are the guiding principle of good economic policies. Secondly, GDP growth doesn't tell us anything about whose money bag has been growing. So you can have a good GDP growth and still you can have a growing gap between poor people and wealthy people. So again, here we need to look into the question whose budgets need to grow. And already within the European Union, we see that there is parts of the population where I clearly think there needs to be some growth of income and possibilities in life. And there needs to be degrowth of the capital accumulation of some of the participants of our society, so the most wealthy ones. So their degrowth is clearly something that we need. If we look at it at the global level, it's a very elaborate discussion that we're having because parts of the world are still having populations that still live from $1 or $2 a day. And I think, in these regions, clearly we have to find ways for population to have a growing income, and in this regard, also a growing economy, while in the most rich countries of the world, I think growth is a concept that we should overcome. And this can also be overcome by taking into consideration other measures. So the real costs of the production of a product, maybe also to answer the question on food prices, how can sustainable food production be cheaper than the conventional one? Well, if you really price the whole costs of production, organic food in average statistically would be a third cheaper than conventional production. So by taxing the real costs of production and the environmental impact, we can also guide consumers to the better choice.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. And you also mentioned one element that we haven't had a lot of time today to talk about, but which we definitely will address in our vision of the European Green Deal, which is the link to the global dimension. You mentioned global inequalities. They have actually been increasing again after years and decades of successes in reducing poverty and reducing hunger in the world, but due to the multi-crisis that we experience, these figures are going up again, and the European Green Deal as it stands now is not very strong in its international dimension and making sure that the EU can support global justice and poverty reduction globally. So thanks for bringing this up. So one last follow-up question for Walter, and then we'll go to our audience with questions. So Walter, you already explained in quite some detail what the problems are with parts of society being left behind when it comes to heating, mobility, and so on, and that we need kind of public provision, or basically a right to affordable and sustainable mobility, housing, heating, and so on. So looking ahead at the elections and your manifesto that you're working on, can you share just like one concrete example or two concrete examples of such policy? How can we make sure that on the one hand, while we're putting a price tag on emissions, how at the same time, with what concrete policy can we make sure that we ensure this right to mobility, housing, heating, and so on?
Well, first of all, it's a matter of a principle. I would not be very confident that the ecological crisis can be solved within the frame of capitalist society. I mean, you can talk about growth and post-growth, and it's obvious that in a limited frame of a planet, economies and societies cannot grow endlessly, but at the same time, you cannot have capitalism without growth. So actually, what we want to explain is that any step of transformation implies limiting the power of the rich, of the wealthy people, the power of capital accumulation. And when it then comes to concrete proposals, of course, housing, energy supply, education, culture cannot be goods which are managed and distributed through markets. So the question is about property. It's about social appropriation of common goods. We would say that everything which serves the interests of the public should be owned by public institutions and should be democratically governed. And I would also say that the issue of ecological transformation replies redistribution of income and wealth. You are right, that has a global dimension. We must be aware of the fact that we are living in a situation in which we live on the expenses of large parts of the global society. So we have to recap the way in which Europe faces the rest of the world. And that means that we need a redistribution of power, redistribution of money, a redistribution of property, and that the European Union and the European elections grant a space in which these issues can be transformed into legislation and into concrete proposals which hopefully are capable of mobilizing large layers of the society. Otherwise, if we don't do that, we will see a very unpleasant result of the European elections, namely the hegemony of forces which are irrationally denying climate change, which are heading for authoritarian solutions, and which are not actually willing to enter into a progressive, emancipatory transformation of our societies.
Thank you. So we're coming to your questions. I thank you all for your interventions. I think they were all clear, also not without controversy. So I hope that this triggering your interest in asking questions to our four representatives here. So we will first see if there are questions from you here in the room. We can only take a handful, and then I will already ask Annelie to be ready to share with me some of questions that we're gathering online. So who has questions for our audience, our four representatives here? Ideally, keep it really short, and maybe you also want to say to whom you're asking your question. That makes it then easier for our panelists to answer. So it's a bit hard to see you, so raise your hands. Who has a question for our four European parties? Yes, I see your first one there, and then here in the front. Maybe one more? We'll start there, and then one more. You can think about it. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Isadora Vronsky from Greenpeace. So you touched upon it, but it really comes down to the economy. So my question is there any work going on to define new fundamental principles upon which we can evolve to really have this have humankind act within a safe space? So if we are to keep within planetary and social boundaries, is there work going on within your political parties of new principles beyond just thinking that production leads to well-being, to really reform your ideologies?
Thank you very much. So we'll take a second question here from the front row. Here, front row. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mikael Karlsson, Uppsala University and previous president of EEB. I have a question to Didrik, because you wanted to give 12 points to Sweden. And I just want to say that that might have been defendable in the past, but since last fall, what we have seen is that Sweden has increased fossil fuel subsidies substantially. It has slashed the environmental budget in a way we have never seen before. It has abolished climate requirements in public procurement. It has shut down the environment ministry. Some weeks back, a new budget proposal came from the government, leading to a 65% cut of the environmental budget in 2026. 65% cut. We have never seen anything like that. And yesterday, the government said it will lower substantially the obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from petrol and diesel used in the transport fleet. All this will, of course, result in huge increases of emissions. So, having given you that information, would you still like to give 12 points to Sweden? Thank you.
Thank you, Mikael, for that one. So do we have one more? Yes, there's one more here in the middle. Microphone is coming.
Hi, thank you. So I'm Hannah Gunnarsson from Women Engaged for a Common Future. And as our name tells, we are an intersectional eco-feminist organization. So my question will be related to that, obviously. But I raised it in the chat. So what pushback have you seen on EU level from far-right wing movements across Europe that we're seeing? And what strategies do you have in place to tackle this kind of pushback that we're seeing also from civil society's point of view? And there's some really good academia from Sweden, such as Martin Hultman, who's doing a lot of analysis on the connections to masculinity and gender norms and how that is also pushing these right-wing movements. So what strategies do you have in place to tackle that?
Thank you, Hannah. That's a very excellent question as well. So maybe we can hear from Annelie a little bit what is her summary of what other questions are coming up online, and if there's other things that people are concerned about.
Well, I mean, the two questions that were the most liked were also now asked by Isadora and Hannah. So another question that has come up is on what are you doing to include negative externalities in decision making on goods and services? How are you targeting the heaviest polluters? That's a concrete question. Yeah, so maybe start that, because you already have three now.
Yes, it's already quite a wealth of questions. So I suggest, I mean, there was one specific invitation to Didrik to comment on his 12 points for Sweden, so I'll invite him to comment on that, and then maybe the others can decide which ones you want to answer. We had one on right-wing populism and what your strategies are there. We had a first question on kind of the principles that should underline economic system change and what your thoughts are there, and a question on negative externalities that are linked to our kind of goods and industries, and how we can target the heaviest polluters there. So let's start with Didrik.
Well, I'm smiling because if there was one thing that I didn't prepare and a bit improvised, and look how this fired back. No, let me. And also, I'm thinking about Thomas Waltz, because he was also commenting slightly diplomatically about the forest policy. So I think he would agree with your point. Look, in general, what I wanted to say was 12 points to the Swedish presidency, and I was really much in mind the efforts that are being done in fields like EPBD. My point is not to pinpoint one country or the other one. All in all, if there is one message to give, is that indeed there are real challenges ahead, and it is a priority. But if you look at the current, this is still a transition at the level worldwide where we are still leading a transition. So maybe to conclude, the best way to say it is that this is 12 points for efforts, not on results yet. Thank you.
Thank you. So shall we move on to the question on strategies to encounter populism and the growing influence of the right-wing parties. Who would like to go first on that one?
Well, I could say a word on this. I think, first of all, we must not make any concessions to right-wing populism. On the contrary, we have to oppose their agenda, the xenophobic agenda. Secondly, we have to change migration policies. We have to put center stage human rights standards when it comes to asylum politics. And third, we have also to see that the readiness of some parts of the society to vote for far-right parties has to do with social disenfranchisement, with disappointment, with frustration. So we have to change social politics to recognize the dignity of working people. And finally, and that is possibly the saddest chapter in all this, that what we see in the last month is that the rise of the far right is promoted by the willingness of the conservative parties, for example, in Austria, to make coalitions with them, to open the floodgate for right-wing populism. And they bear a huge responsibility for that that is going on. Still, I'm optimistic. We have had now in Salzburg regional elections where my small and still not very important party, the Communist Party of Austria, managed to become stronger than the right populist party simply by promoting a social agenda and refusing any concessions to the xenophobic, racist agenda which these parties are proposing.
Thank you, Walter. Is there any other comment on this issue from any of the other panelists? Thomas, you're hesitating.
No, I was just hesitating because you were limiting it to only that question. I can sign up partly to what my colleague Walter Bayer just said, and this is also the Swedish example. I mean, it's liberals backing a coalition with conservatives that is basically dependent on the votes of a former Nazi extreme right populist party. So I think this is a major mistake to do these kinds of things, but that's going very far into party politics now. I think what we have to acknowledge is that there's a lot of fear in population that the multiple crises are having a direct impact on the sense of security of daily life to citizens. And that means our role as politicians is to come up with very clear solutions that work for the vast majority of the population and that show that there's a path, a way out of the crisis. And this is our responsibility to clearly showcase that and to show that environmental politics is not an elitistic question, but it's a question of the masses, and it's a question of the welfare and well-being of the big majority of our populations. And this is our responsibility, and we need to deliver that. And I think this will also decrease the amount of votes far-right parties can get. By the way, thanks for that question also when it comes to toxic masculinity. And I'm a male representative today, but of a party that is clearly having a bigger power share on the female side, which is something very positive because, I mean, it's not, you cannot generalize it, but mostly women are looking more towards the common good, and males, unfortunately, very often look into their personal fortune. And so this is something we need to counter. Our whole development of society is moving towards equality, but it's also a main job for us as politicians to question toxic masculine concepts and put the common good at the forefront of our decision making. So thanks for every eco-feminist initiatives. That's very helpful.
Thank you, Thomas. And I think I would like then to ask, go to Ellie, because you haven't spoken yet, and ask you about this question we got on the negative externalities. We've spoken a little bit about the fact that the European Green Deal as it stands is not very strong on its international dimension. We've seen some progress, for instance, with deforestation law. Well, we have to see how that turns out and how it will actually reduce the negative externalities. But there are many more negative externalities that the EU is responsible for. And there are many heavy polluters that have not yet been targeted. So are there any other ideas that your party would be supporting to reduce the negative externalities that we currently have?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, looking into especially taxing fossil fuels, what has been done so far, we really need to implement the windfall tax on fossil fuels, and we need to target those that we have already been keeping on our eye. But then at a more global level, we need to bring together the big emitters, and we need to pass on the message that we are all in this together. So most of you might have been a bit disappointed about the results of COP27. What we need to do is to really come together with a strong mandate ahead of COP28 and push to meet the targets of climate neutrality by 2050, to keeping global warming to 1.5% Celsius. I think that Europe has been leading by example, but absolutely more needs to be done to address negative externalities. And I would just like also to pick up on what was said before, because the gender dimension of climate policy was brought up. And yes, I want to also second support to gender policies and gender mainstreaming in the sector, because women are particularly affected by climate change, and this is something that should appear in policy making across political parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellie. And actually, we have published a report a couple of years ago about why we need an eco-feminist European Green Deal, showing how gender equality has been missing from most of the European Deal policies, even where there's very strong evidence about the gendered aspect in them. So thanks for mentioning this. So we're coming very close to the end of our time. So there was still this one question about principles underlying economic systems change towards a well-being economy. So here's a challenge for you. I want to hear one word, one principle from each of you that you connect to the idea of well-being economy and economic system change. So, Diederik, one principle.
I would argue it's an equilibrium, if you want one word. It's an equilibrium between not only gender, but also the policies we might have, economic elements, market development, involvement of research. Equilibrium is my word.
Okay, thank you. Thomas, do you have one principle that you connect to economic system change?
I think I spoke a lot about it already, but it's basically taking the reality into account and it's about fairness and scientific, basing political decisions on scientific realities.
Yes, thank you. Walter, one principle.
Two keywords, caring and sharing, meaning caring for one another, which is a principle of feminism, which was introduced in our political program. And sharing, I would say, is one of the impacts also of those in the religious communities who are concerned about the development of the world. So caring and sharing would be the ideological orientations which are new in the left, which I represent.
Okay, thank you. And Ellie, your one principle?
I think that we have to go back to the notion of public goods. We have to consider water, food, energy. We have to consider the housing as a public good. Transport is also a public good. So we really need to go back to the basics.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very clear. Okay, so we had one last Slido question for you, and I would like you to answer that still for us to wrap up this panel. So you've heard a lot about a possible European Green Deal 2, possible elements that we can imagine and that we would like to see. So the question for you is, how confident are you right now that we'll get a European Green Deal 2? So if you go to Slido and let me know, and then maybe I can ask our tech support to already display the answer on the screen so we can directly see it. That gives you a little bit of time to answer. Oh, there's no poll? Well, then I guess we'll just have to skip that. You can think about it and talk about it over coffee after we close. Well, that leaves me to, first thank all our panelists. Thank you so much for making time today in a busy Strasbourg week and other busy days, I'm sure, for you. So thank you very much for joining us. And we will be glad to follow up with you, with your parties, in the development of your election manifestos to discuss more in depth what our vision for the European Green Deal 2 is. So thank you very much again for joining us today, to all 4 of you. And now we have we have Slido back. So quick, give me an answer. How confident are you that we get an EGD2? I'll give you 10 or 20 seconds, so we have a good sample of answers. It is necessary. Okay. Okay, so there seems to be broad agreement that it's necessary, or even absolutely necessary. Slight skepticism that there's a lot of resistance, so we're not sure. It's definitely necessary, but whether we get it or not is not sure. I guess that's not too bad. There's an agreement that we need it, but I think it's also a call to action for all of us to make it happen, to work together in the next months, to push the European parties and the election manifestos to reflect all of our demands. So thank you for participating to the survey. So then with no further delay, we'll actually straight go into the next session, which is the reaction from youth to this political panel, but also to other things that our speaker might have heard throughout the day. So we have with us online Bonolo Madibe from Youth and Environment Europe, YEE. She's in charge of external relations. And for those of you who don't know, YEE is the largest network of independent youth environmental organizations in Europe. They're also part of our EEB family. So we're really happy that Bonolo can join us. Unfortunately, online, you're meant to be here with us, and we really miss you. But thank you so much for joining us remotely. So, Bonolo, what's your reaction to what you've heard from our European party representatives, and what are your demands, your vision for a European Green Deal 2? The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Patricia. And it's great to be with you all today. Unfortunately, it had to be online, and I would have loved to have joined in person. I think today I would like to kind of speak to you guys about the achievements and the gaps of the European Green Deal, and how the youth environmental movement, particularly in this case represented by YEE, can contribute to existing efforts to drive collective change. As we know, the Green Deal was established with the goal of making the European climate neutral by 2050, to transform the EU's economy and society into a more sustainable one. But what does this mean for the youth environmental movement, and how do we feel about the achievements of the Green Deal so far? Whilst there have been some positive developments that we welcome, as that has been discussed today, such as the increased ambition of the EU's climate targets, the creation of the Just Transition Fund to support regions and communities affected by transition, and the proposal of the European climate law to make targets of net zero and gas emissions by 2050 legally binding, you may have also seen from protests today, young people want more action from decision makers and member states. There are gaps where the European Green Deal lacks ambition and speed. For example, the EU's target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030 is not enough to actually keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, as recommended by the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change. Additionally, the EU's emissions trading system still allows for too many free allowances and offsets, which undermines its effectiveness in reducing emissions. Another key area of concern for us is air pollution, which is responsible for over 400,000 premature deaths in the EU every day. The European Green Deal has proposed some measures to address this issue, but they've not been ambitious enough to fully protect public health and the environment. Looking ahead towards the election in early 2024, we are concerned about the current backlash against more ambitious environmental protections and climate action by certain industry groups and right-wing parties across the EU. They are trying to water down regulations on chemicals, pesticides, and nature restorations, amongst other things, and in order to protect their own economic interests. This for us is unacceptable, and we urge EU institutions to stand firm in their commitments to sustainability and not be swayed by lobbying and misinformation. As for our demands for the European political parties in the lead up to the upcoming elections, we want you to prioritize sustainability and put it at the center of your policies. We ask you to commit for more ambitious climate targets, stricter regulations on polluting industries and stronger regulations on chemical use, stronger protections for biodiversity and ecosystems, and greater investment in renewable energy, sustainable transport, and circular economy, all topics we've heard a lot about today. We ask that you listen to and engage with the voices of young people and other marginalized stakeholders who are affected by your decisions. Finally, we believe that the European Green Deal 2 should be based on the concept of integrated sustainable development, which means that environmental, social, and economic goals should be pursued together in a holistic manner. The main principle or building blocks of this pact of our common future should be climate justice, circularity, biodiversity protection, and social inclusion and resilience. By putting these principles into practice, we can create a more just and sustainable Europe for ourselves and for future generations. But before we close the day off, I have a quick question for you all, so please get your Slido apps ready for some responses. Considering the current and expected political backlash against stronger environmental and climate policies as we measure to ensure more equitable societies, are you ready to build bridges and to join forces to work together and step up our ambition and actions across the region to ensure environmental and social justice in Europe globally? It would be great to get some of your thoughts on that quickly.
Great. Yes, go ahead.
I was just about to say, it would be great to see more collaboration amongst us as a movement. As we've heard today on during the conference, we've had a lot of right-wing movements who actually are able to mobilize and move forward because they are able to come together and present a united message. So for us, collaboration is a key part, and we hope that you are ready to work closely with different parts of the environmental and social justice movement, science in particular, and supportive decision makers to drive collective change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonolo. So we already have the results ready. Do you see them as well?
They're not as clear on my end, unfortunately.
Okay, so I can read them out for you. So the first answer, yes, I'm ready to collaborate more, get nearly, well, 74% of the answers. So people seem to be very ready to collaborate, and another 26%, so that's basically all support cooperation towards our common goals. So what does that tell you? Is that something hopeful? That makes you hopeful?
Fantastic news. Thank you all.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today, even if you couldn't be here with us in Stockholm today. Thanks for sharing the demands from the youth environmental movement. I hope that you will be an integral part of further developing the European Green Deal 2 with us, because I believe if there's one thing which we cannot afford towards the election next year is to lose young people, to frustrate them so much that they will refrain from going to the ballot. So we need you all to vote, we need you all to engage in this, and we need to bring all of your friends and peers along, because that's one thing that we definitely cannot risk next year in the European elections. So this is the end of the presentation and the discussion around the European Green Deal 2. So we're coming already to the closing part and the summary of our conference, Anneli.
Yes, we are. And to do that, I'll invite up Patrick and Johanna. You've met them both before. Patrick, Secretary General of the EEB, and Johanna this time wearing both her president hats, both the SSNC and the EEB. It's very practical to have a person representing two organizations at the same time. So, it's been a very intense and, full day. Patrick, what's your main takeaways sort of from this day?
Right, no, thank you very much. I think it's been like almost like gold mining in a very positive sense without the environmental harm or social harm associated with it, because there's been a huge number of really important points. So just to pick up a few, I think for me the very, very clear message starting in the morning and going on to the political session was the fundamental importance of the social dimension being integrated. So that will be very, very core to us. I very much liked the very early mention of the moral imperative, as I studied philosophy years ago as well as science and economics, but moral imperative, this is what we face around the Green Deal too. We need to address that. I also liked very much the very, very clear thinking saying that basically the fossil fuel industry will disappear. I mean, we have a change of society. There will be changes in which industries will be the future, which industry in the past. And there it's fundamentally important that the policies we have today don't try to safeguard the policies of yesterday, but actually, or the industries of yesterday, but the ones that are there, what we need for 2040 and 2050. I very much liked also still in the climate issue, the talking about sort of solution realism, and I think that's very, very important, mentioning res and renewable and reduction of materials, and also identifying the sort of solutions denial, because I think there's a lot of distraction by focusing on things that don't work. So why waste time on it? Why waste political capital? Why waste money? We haven't got the time, the capital, or the money to waste. Then if we go on to the biodiversity, I think that it was good to be reminded that sometimes the early building blocks are fantastic. The farm to fork strategy lays the foundation. The nature restoration law is the first time in a long time that you've got a positive agenda rather than a negative agenda. Then something I hadn't thought about at all, which was really nice, was to learn, is to also think about marine heat waves. I think we should talk more about the oceans. It's often a forgotten part of a very, very important agenda. It was good to be reminded of the importance of Aarhus. A lot of people, including my colleagues, have worked hard on that. Aarhus is important. We should safeguard it. So if it's going to be in danger of being lost to the nature restoration law, we should actually fight hard to keep it, because it was a hell of a battle to get progress on that. Then if we go forward onto the chemicals, I thought it was horrifying to hear that already in the 1960s we heard that people knew, companies knew that PFAS was a danger, and yet we continued using it. And it's only in the 2020s the politicians are starting to do something. So it's clear that voluntary approaches by business doesn't work. And why does it take 60 years to get progress? Which gets to discussions later that we had in terms of the vested interests and the political power associated with vested interests. And 60 years is just 60 years of unacceptable delay. And I can go on and on with lots of different examples, but maybe to try to also leave time for everyone else. We had a lot of white elephants, but we talked about peace in Europe, and I just want to underline that this Green Deal that we've mentioned is actually a peace project. If you think about it, allowing us to become independent from fossil fuel dependency, material dependency, I think we need to look at that. And if you listen to the four political speeches in the end, there were interesting elements in each. And so what we need to hopefully do is to be able to construct a Green Deal 2 that builds on the intelligent ideas of the different parties into something that everyone can stand behind, because we need one society to work towards something, so that the last speaker can have some hope that her future and other youth's future are actually listened to. So that's what I take, and I'm very much at the end is I like the fact that 100% of people said let's collaborate, and I think maybe we'll stop on that, because you can't get a stronger message than that.
Thank you, Patrick. Good to get a reminder of all the good things, or thoughtful things that have been said. What about you, Johanna? What's your main takeaways?
Well, perhaps from a different angle, trying to see a common thread through the morning, or said in the different panels. I think that message was that there are already a lot of visions, goals, targets addressed in different fora. I mean, we have the Paris Agreement, the results from the CBD, we have the chemical strategy, etc., etc. But another thing that was stressed was there is a lack of leadership, lack of political leadership that, and perhaps particularly on member state level in some cases. And there is a lack of a convincing narrative. And perhaps I think that's one of the reasons why we saw in the starting of the morning in the Slido that quite a large group of part of this group here is not sure that we can actually reach the climate targets. So there is this lack of leadership and a narrative that is convincing that we will solve the problems. So we have all these visions, goals, targets, but there is an implementation gap. And in some cases, it's perhaps a lack of decency that was mentioned here on stage before, not implementing the polluter pays principle or the precautionary principle. And sometimes it's not even, there's no legislation, it's not enough ambitious legislation. And sometimes innovation, such as in the chemicals example, innovation is faster than legislation. And in other cases, legislation is not taking just transition into account, and there is a resistance from the society around where this legislation is happening. There is also a matter of a problem when legislation is done in silos. That was mentioned several times that the holistic view is not taken into account, and there becomes, the conflicts between different climate action legislations or biodiversity, etc., etc. And also the problem with not including relevant actors when developing legislation, such as academia or indigenous peoples, etc., etc. So that for me was a sort of a common thread through the morning.
Yeah, and I guess then, like, you identified a few problems, and I guess the opposite to those problems is how we move ahead. So do you want to add to that more on the way forward, or you think you already?
Well, I think that it's clear that we need a Green Deal too. That's clear from the whole the day, all of the sessions today. And I think that the response to this poll that was one of the last ones we did here, if it will happen. I think if we listen to the politicians or the party representatives that were here now, I think that it's something that we will see. But of course, they are not representing all parties, and therefore it's so important with the next elections in 2024, because we need a parliament and we need a commission that is willing to push a new Green Deal, a Green Deal 2, that is more ambitious than the previous one, taking into account new areas and the holistic view that we've been discussing, and also making sure that we implement the legislation and visions that are already in place. And also I think it's important then to involve different actors to make sure that the legislation is done in the right way from the beginning. And there are so many different groups. The youth perspective here is of course very important, indigenous peoples, academia, social movement, progressive industry, and environmental movement representatives, etc., etc. So, well, that's part of what I think needs to be done.
Yeah. So you've already established we need a European Green Deal too. And moving to Patrick, what do you see as the next steps for the EGD?
Right. No, thanks very much. I think it's very, very clear. We've got 12, 14 months to finish the legislative process of the Green Deal that we have. This was been articulated all morning that there's a whole bunch of pressures against it. So we need to really work together to avoid these things being delayed or dropped or diluted. That is absolutely essential. So then we need to all work together towards the European elections so that we actually make sure the debate is focused on the things that are actually will affect all of us, all of our children, the next generation, rather than just having bumper stickers which sound good. It needs to be focused on the essence, and we really can't afford to lose the next 5 years by getting the wrong parliament, and hence the wrong sort of constellation eventually for the Commission. So we need the Green Deal too, and it has to integrate all of those elements that we've already discussed. But then I suspect we'll also need a Green Deal 3 and a Green Deal 4 and a Green Deal 5, and then all of us can retire and relax in 2050 when we've solved everything. But anyway, so we use the word hope a lot, and I think that's really, really important. But hope is one of these strange words, because at one level it's positive, and I'm not going back to the sort of the 6th century Augustinian discussion about hope versus faith. Don't worry, I'm not going there. But hope actually is something, but we need more than hope. We need action, we need collaboration, we need results. So this is basically where we have to be there. We have to take the hope to pull us together. Then we need to identify, a bit like across the political parties, lots of people have got different ideas. Which clever bits can we use from different people to work together to actually get the action and agency on the ground to create basically the future we want? I haven't got that many years left, but I think it's for the youth presented before and the youth after that. We need to collectively make sure that there's a positive legacy for each of them, so they have the future that they deserve. And that's just basically back to it. It's a moral imperative for us to do that. So that's what I'd say. Oh, and one thing, just to say that in terms of the process, I mean, we presented here a number of ideas. There's no way I could have gone through all those bullets. What we're going to have is we're also circulating not only the slides, but we'll pull together some papers. If you have any ideas and suggestions on what's important to you in terms of addressing the gaps, the barriers, where to accelerate, issues of principles and so on, the other elements we didn't talk, please get in touch. We'll also launch 2, 3 or 4 different stakeholder discussions. We're trying to have a close discussion with the whole social community to really make sure that we integrate the social solutions into that. And we'll also have a discussion with youth. We'll try to have a discussion with progressive business as well, think tanks to make sure academia is there, and then of course the wider decision-making community, so it's also absorbed. So anyone who wishes to be in touch and help co-create this is what we'll be aiming for all the way to the next elections. And then we'll hope to have a Green Deal 2, which can be a plug-and-play version ready for the next President of the Commission to say, oh, I like that, let's take that and let's set the agenda.
Thank you. Now we've come to the thanks, to the ending and the thanks, and we're all on stage already. So first to you.
Who do I start thanking?
You're gone. Thank you. Go on.
We want to thank. Well, I want to thank everyone here attending in person and everyone attending online. Great that you joined this conference on very, very important topics. And I also would like to thank you for guiding us through the day in a very calm and nice and professional way. So thanks a lot. And also, of course, all the facilitators, all the panelists being on stage and talking to us in a very knowledgeable and great way. And of course, all the organizers from the SNC and from the EEB and Patrick and you.
Right.
There's so many thank you.
You've not left me very much, but well, first of all, the technicians, it's often forgotten. But then also basically to thank the SSNC. I mean, because this has been a really close collaboration between us over the last year. And it's been brilliant. It's been almost effortless. We've been impressed by your professionalism, and all of us want to now in the Brussels office become a little bit more Swedish, at least with respect to your image of Sweden, not the entire image of Sweden. I don't want to get 12 points in the wrong place. And then now I've just distracted myself from my final thing I wanted to say. Anyway, I'm sure you'll have lots of thanks to give as well, but a huge thanks. Oh, yes, I remember now. Just a lot of our members have come from all over Europe. This is often a huge effort, especially those that came by sea and by train and by bicycle. And this is a big effort. So we've tried to make today as interesting as we could possibly make it. But yesterday evening was a real additional bonus. We were able to go, thanks to Stockholm City Hall, to basically see the Nobel House. All of us dreamt about one day getting a Nobel Prize. And maybe this is the objective for us. If all of us collectively work together, that maybe in 10 years, in 20 years, we'll get a joint Nobel Prize for all of us for having solved the problem that has beleaguered us. So then we can come back again.
I would still like I would still like to thank all the dozens of colleagues from SSNC and EEB who are not visible on stage, but who are making this happen, from our comms team, our membership team, our events team, the policy team. So thank you so much, everybody, for collaborating. It's been a lot of fun over this 1 year to make this happen all together. So that's been wonderful.
It has been wonderful. It's good. It's a great thing having having all representatives from all over Europe, from environmental movement, coming to Stockholm, welcoming you.
And we thank you very much for inviting us to Stockholm. And that also leaves me to say that it's not over yet. So for all the EB members, we'll actually continue after a due break with the beginning of our annual general meeting here in the Culture Center. But before we start at 4 o'clock, you now have more time to mingle, continue discussions that you probably started over lunch. So there will be some fika arrangement outside. If you don't know what fika is, you can ask your Swedish friends what it is, and you can find out outside. So feel free to stay, even if you're not attending the AGM, until 4 o'clock before we have to resume our meetings. And I understand that we have already set up the tables for the AGM. So if you see tables with white tablecloth, please stay away from them. It's not that we don't trust your manners, but they're meant to be for our AGM later on. So help yourself to coffee, tea, and cake. And well, thank you all for coming. And actually, next year we'll be hosting our annual conference again in Brussels. And just so that you can already scribble that down in your agendas, we're going to be celebrating 50 years of EEB. So you can expect not only a conference, but also some celebrations. So yeah, stay tuned, and we hope that many of you will find your ways to Brussels next year. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.